Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive, and today we're going way back.
Way, way back.
We're talking post-World War II Japan, a nation rebuilding from, well, pretty much nothing.
Yeah, it was a massive undertaking, to say the least.
And we're going to uncover how this devastated nation not only recovered, but rose to become the economic giant we know today. It's a story full of twists and turns, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And some might say unexpected alliances.
Exactly. So let's set the scene. It's 1945. The war is finally over. But what's left of Japan?
Honestly, not much. We're talking cities reduced to rubble, the economy in shambles, and U.S. forces occupying the country.
It's hard to imagine starting over from scratch like that.
It is. And this is where General Douglas MacArthur comes in. He was basically the man in charge of the U.S. occupation.
And his vision for Japan?
It was about more than just rebuilding. MacArthur wanted to reshape Japan, to mold it in the way that aligned with U.S. interests.
It's almost like hitting a reset button on Japan's entire system.
Yeah, you could say that.
What were the main goals? What did the U.S. envision for Japan's future?
Well, the number one concern for the U.S. back then was the spread of communism, especially in Asia.
Right, the Cold War was just heating up.
Exactly. And a democratic, capitalist Japan that was seen as the perfect antidote. They wanted Japan as a strong ally, a buffer against, say, China and the Soviet Union.
So Japan becomes this really strategic piece on the global chessboard.
Exactly. And to achieve that, they knew they had to make some big changes. We're talking about a complete overhaul.
What kind of changes are we talking about here?
Well, first, demilitarization. Japan's military was completely dismantled.
Wow, stripped of their military power. That must have been a tough pill to swallow.
It was a huge shift. And then came a brand new constitution, one that promoted pacifism and democratic values.
Hold on, a pacifist constitution. That's pretty unbelievable given Japan's history. Are you saying they actually renounced war?
They did. Article 90 of this new constitution. It explicitly renounced war as a sovereign right.
Wow, that's a powerful statement.
Right. Talk about a 180. It was a clear signal about the direction the U.S. wanted Japan to take. Of course, beyond the political and military restructuring, the U.S. also focused on reviving Japan's economy.
Which, let's face it, was in ruins.
Totally. But they knew that a strong Japanese economy would also benefit their own strategic goals in the region.
It's amazing how these strategies were all intertwined. So the U.S. is in Japan, making these sweeping changes. But then comes the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951. How did that impact Japan?
Yeah, the Treaty of San Francisco. It's generally seen as the official end of the war between Japan and the Allied powers, but it was so much more than that.
In what way?
Well, it really cemented Japan's new role in the world, a world that was already getting caught up in the Cold War. And it really underlined Japan's place in the U.S.'s strategy of containment against, you guessed it, communism.
So we're talking about preventing the spread of communism. How did this treaty help achieve that?
Think of it this way. Japan is right in the heart of Asia, right? The U.S. needed a reliable ally in that region, someone they could count on to be a capitalist force.
And that's the role they saw for Japan.
Exactly. Now, here's where it's really interesting. Alongside the treaty, they also signed the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty.
Okay, so this is a separate agreement, but connected to the Treaty of San Francisco.
Right. And this security treaty allowed the U.S. to keep military bases on Japanese soil.
Wow, so it's a two-way street, officially ending the war, but also forging this alliance against a common enemy.
Right. And this arrangement had huge implications for both countries. It ensured Japan's security while giving the U.S. a strategic foothold in the region. It's something historian Michael Schaller highlighted really well.
What did he say?
Well, he called Japan the keystone of U.S. efforts in Asia during the Cold War. Think about it. Japan, a pro-American capitalist nation right there in the Pacific.
A major win for the U.S. It really makes you realize how much weight these historical events still carry. Decisions made decades ago still shaping global dynamics today.
Absolutely. And speaking of things that still resonate today, we can't forget about the incredible transformation of Japan's economy.
Right, from the ashes of war to an economic powerhouse, the Japanese economic miracle, as they call it. Now, that's a story worth diving into. The Japanese economic miracle. It sounds almost like a myth, doesn't it?
Right. It's hard to fathom how a country goes from utter devastation to one of the world's top economies in just a couple of decades.
It really is incredible. Where do you even begin with explaining something like that?
Well, it definitely wasn't just one factor. It was a whole bunch of things coming together at the right time.
Like what?
Well, you have to remember, Japan was literally starting from scratch. But the thing is, the Japanese people, they showed incredible resilience.
They were determined to rebuild.
Exactly. They had this drive to innovate, to compete on a global scale. But it wasn't just willpower, of course. There were also some really smart strategic decisions made along the way.
And what were some of those key decisions?
Well, one of the most significant was what's known as the Yoshida Doctrine.
Okay, the Yoshida Doctrine. Now, that name rings a bell. Remind me, what was the core idea behind it?
So remember how we talked about Article 9 of the Constitution, how Japan renounced war? The Yoshida Doctrine basically took that principle and turned it into a whole economic strategy.
Okay, so they renounced war and...
They went all in on economic development. Instead of pouring resources into rebuilding their military, they focused on becoming an economic powerhouse.
That's a bold move, especially during the Cold War. Weren't they worried about security threats?
That's the thing. They were essentially putting their faith in the U.S. to provide security, which freed them up to focus on industries like manufacturing, technology, exports.
So they doubled down on economic growth.
Exactly. And it paid off big time. The Japanese people were incredibly adaptable, skilled at incorporating new technologies, new manufacturing processes. They prioritized quality, efficiency, innovation.
And that helped them rocket to the top.
Pretty much. It
Yeah.
really challenged those old assumptions about what it took to be a powerful nation in the post-war world.
So you're saying military might wasn't the only path to global influence?
Right. And historian John Dower, he's written a lot about this, about how Japan's success wasn't built on military strength, but on strategic investments in industry, trade, technology.
It's a different path.
It really is. And it makes you wonder, what if they had focused on rebuilding their military? Would they have achieved the same level of economic success? It's a fascinating what-if scenario.
And it brings up another question. We've been focusing on the U.S.'s role in shaping Japan after the war. But how much of Japan's success was actually due to their own choices and actions?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And that's where things get really interesting, because historians have very different perspectives on this.
You're saying there's no one definitive answer.
Exactly. There are different schools of thought when it comes to analyzing the U.S.'s influence and motivations and how effective their strategies really were.
Different schools of thought, huh? So what are some of the most popular interpretations of what went down in Japan?
Well, there's the traditional view, what historians call the orthodox perspective.
And what did they think?
They saw the U.S.'s role in Japan as a total success story.
Makes sense. A pretty straightforward interpretation.
Right. They argue that the occupation achieved exactly what it set out to do. Japan transformed into a democratic, capitalist society. And they say it worked to contain the spread of communism. It's a narrative you usually hear, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the one I remember learning in school. But I'm guessing there are other, maybe more critical interpretations out there.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where the revisionists come in.
The revisionists.
Yeah, they take a much more critical view of the whole thing.
How so?
Well, they argue that the U.S. was mostly motivated by, let's say, self-interest.
So not entirely altruistic then?
Not exactly. They say the main goal was actually to reshape Japan's economy to benefit American businesses.
It was more about securing access to those markets.
Exactly. They argue that the U.S. used the occupation to advance their own economic interests in the region. It wasn't just about spreading democracy, they say, but about gaining a foothold,
Interesting. So we have two very different takes here. What about that third perspective you mentioned?
Right, the post-revisionists. They try to find some middle ground.
As in a more balanced view.
Exactly. They acknowledge it's a complicated story. It wasn't just the U.S. calling all the shots. Japan made its own choices, too.
I had some agency.
Yes, exactly. And their decisions played a key role in how things turned out. They point out that Japan, especially with the Yoshida Doctrine, made some very strategic moves that benefited them, even if those moves didn't always line up perfectly with what the U.S. wanted.
It's rarely that simple.
Never is. And finally, you've got the post-Cold War historians. They have the benefit of hindsight, of course.
They can look back and see the whole picture.
Exactly. And they tend to put more emphasis on the mutually beneficial aspects of the U.S.-Japan relationship.
Mutually beneficial, so both sides came out ahead.
Right. They'd say Japan benefited from those U.S. security guarantees, and that allowed them, to really focus on economic growth. But at the same time, the U.S. got a valuable, stable ally in a region that was strategically vital.
A win-win, you might say.
In a way, yes.
It's interesting to consider those different perspectives. It reminds us that history is never really black and white. There are always different sides to the story.
It's about shades of gray, really. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about this whole period. It's not just about understanding what happened, but about grappling with the lasting impact on Japan's identity.
How so?
Well, decisions that were made decades ago, they're still shaping Japan's role in the world today. It's pretty remarkable when you think about it.
Give me an example. What are some of the biggest takeaways, you think?
Well, take Article 9, for instance. That commitment to pacifism, it continues to influence Japan's foreign policy today, even as the country grapples with global security issues.
That's incredible how much influence a single article in their constitution still has.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It makes you realize how powerful those turning points in a nation's history can be. And then there's the legacy of the Yoshida Doctrine. Remember, Japan basically decided to go all in on economic power, innovation, technological advancement. And that didn't just disappear when the Cold War ended.
It became a core part of who they are.
Absolutely. You could even argue it became a defining characteristic of modern Japan, a driving force behind their rise as a global economic leader.
It's inspiring in a way.
It is. And those choices have had huge ripple effects, not just within Japan, but globally. I mean, think about how far Japanese brands have spread, how influential Japanese culture has become.
You're right. They're practically synonymous with quality and innovation worldwide.
Right. And you can trace a lot of that back to this period of intense transformation.
It makes you wonder, though, about the future. We're living in a very different world now. New alliances, new global challenges. How does a country with Japan's history navigate such a constantly changing landscape?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's something they're actively wrestling with right now. There's actually a big debate going on in Japan right now about revising Article 9.
Wow, so a potential shift away from pacifism.
Well, there are some who think Japan needs to take on a more active military role in the region, especially with all the rising global tensions. It's a real balancing act for them. How do you honor the pacifist ideals of the past while also facing the realities of the present? It's a tough one.
It is. And it reminds us that history isn't just something we read about in textbooks. It's alive. It's constantly evolving, shaping our world today. And I guess that's the point of these deep dives, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's about making those connections.
Between then and now.
Exactly. And I think Japan's journey from post-war devastation to economic superpower really highlights that. It's a story about resilience, adaptability, and making tough decisions. And those are lessons we can all learn from.
Absolutely. So from a nation in ruins to a global leader, Japan's story is a reminder that even in the face of incredible challenges, there's always room for innovation, for growth.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's a powerful example of how to navigate a really complicated world and how to forge a new path forward. And on that note, we'll have to leave it there for today. But I encourage everyone listening to keep asking these questions.
Keep exploring those fascinating stories from the past.
Because they really do have the power to shape our world today.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.